Bienvenidos todos aquí a otro evento de Fundación Libertad. Es un placer recibirlos. Ya vamos a estar dando comienzo. Estamos haciendo una pequeña introducción en español y tenemos un verdadero honor de tenerlo a Matt Ridley aquí con nosotros. Así que 1 minuto, 2 minutos que todavía está entrando gente y ya vamos a dar comienzo. Bienvenidos, es un placer tenerlos aquí con nosotros. Es realmente para nosotros un evento muy, muy especial aquí en Fundación Libertad. Ya estamos además grabando. Bien, les decía, evento con Matt Ridley, lo tenemos aquí, ya lo pueden ver. Ya nos pueden acompañar. Es realmente un honor, un placer, un privilegio. Lo tenemos aquí con nosotros a lo largo de 1 hora aproximadamente. Vamos a estar charlando con él de unos 30 a unos 45 minutos la primera parte, donde vamos a estar haciendo una pequeña entrevista. Siéntanse libres ya de ir sumando preguntas en la zona del chat, que también vamos a estar compartiendo con ustedes. So that was the part in Spanish, as I promised Dr. Matt Ridley, and I think I froze.
Yes.
Escuchamos bien, Garrett.
Yeah, I think I froze. That's the magic of Zoom. I was about to speak in English. I was making the change in languages, and I guess that Zoom knew about that. So now I am back. As I was saying, we are so proud and so privileged, and it's such a pleasure to have Dr. Matt Ridley here with us today. He needs no presentation, but it's what it's accustomed to do, will do one, because if you're already here, you know him. But Matt Ridley's book have sold over 1 million copies, been translated into 31 languages, and won several awards. His books include The Red Queen, Genome, The Rational Optimist, and The Evolution of Everything. His book on how innovation works was published in 2020. He joined the House of Lords in February 2013 and has served on the Science and Technology Select Committee and the Artificial Intelligence Select Committee. He was founding chairman of the International Center for Life in Newcastle. He created the Mind and Matter column in the Wall Street Journal in 2010 and was a columnist for the Times 2013-2018. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He lives in Northumberland. Matt, we are so pleased to have you. Welcome to Fundación Libertad. Welcome virtually to Argentina.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be in the beautiful city of Buenos Aires. I wish I was there in person, but it's nice to be with you virtually anyway.
So glad to have you. I'm in Rosario as well, where Fundación Libertad has its main offices. Maybe you know Rosario because of Lionel Messi.
I know of Rosario because of Lionel Messi, but I've not been to Rosario.
Well, we'll have you with us someday, Matt. I guess that we have maybe an obvious question to start with, but it's an important one nonetheless. We've been over 12 months, 30 months already of the pandemic, maybe even more, depending how we count it. What surprised you of humanity throughout this year? What was the most surprising thing that you witnessed?
I think the thing that surprised me most was the willingness of populations to suspend liberty. I think the degree to which we have all accepted that government can tell us whether we go for a walk, whether we see our relatives, etc., is quite striking. I'm dismayed actually by how much my fellow human beings seem to enjoy being told what to do by those in authority. I'm not a complete lockdown skeptic. I think we did need to take a lot of measures to prevent the spread of the virus. I think social distancing of some kind was absolutely indispensable, but I think the copying a communist country's response, which is essentially what we did a year ago, and making everything as a centralized direction is dismaying. And at the same time, I also, well, I'll stop there and I'll let you ask another question. I'm sorry, there's a telephone ringing in the background. I'll just mute.
don't worry about the telephone. I mean, you're letting us in into your office, into your house. So it's part of what we've all gotten accustomed to. You were telling us, and it was quite interesting, and I agree completely with the willingness of population to suspend liberty, which is quite a worrisome thing that has been happening throughout this last year, Matt. And let's tie it with one of your most famous books, The Rational Optimist. You've gone on the record saying, I am certainly not saying don't worry, be happy. Rather, I'm saying don't despair, be ambitious. Um, how hard is it to remain an optimist, being surrounded by such an amount of irrationality? Yes, we have to unmute you. We'll do that in just 1 second. That's the magic of Zoom. Let's do that. Yeah, I think we are there, right?
Perfect.
Perfect.
Thank you. Sorry, I muted myself, but then it turns out I'm not allowed to unmute myself. Every year since I wrote The Rational Optimist, people have said to me, you cannot still be a rational optimist. Look at what's happening in the world. Look at what's happening in the financial crisis. Look at what's happening in the Eurozone crisis. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, in Syria, with Ebola virus, and now, of course, with the pandemic. And I always say, yes, these are bad things. I never said bad things wouldn't happen. Bad things will happen. And one of them I said might be a pandemic. Actually, I did say that in the book. But that doesn't prevent the gradual improvement of human living standards. And I still think that. I think the pandemic is a temporary setback. I think in some ways it will help us to refocus our energies on the things that matter. And in fact, already as a result of the pandemic, we have developed a new technology in the shape of messenger RNA vaccines that could be very, very useful against, for example, cancer. And certainly against other infectious diseases. So I think out of this pandemic will come some very good opportunities to improve the world, which will not make it worth it. Obviously, it's not worth it for 3 million people to die unnecessarily, and I think it was unnecessary. I think this pandemic could have been prevented if China had been more open at the start of it. But given that we have suffered so much, it's good that we will be able to get back to some kind of life. And I don't agree with those who say that we have learnt during the pandemic that we don't need to travel, that we don't need to see our friends, that we must not consume so many goods and so on. I think that way lies a very bleak future for humanity. So I believe in getting back to as much communication and encounters as we can in order to innovate and to improve our lives. One of the things I was actually going to say before, and I think it's relevant in this context, is that imagine if this pandemic had occurred 10 years ago. I think it would have been very different. I think you would not have been able to have Zoom meetings. There was Skype, but there wasn't much else. Most people didn't have broadband. So it would have been impossible to migrate so much work online. And as a result, we would not have locked down our societies so enthusiastically. And I think that's a very interesting point, that it's because the technologies have advanced that it made it possible for governments to take away so much of our liberty, albeit temporarily.
Matt, so many threads to actually go through in your answer just now. I actually wanted to ask you, because you said that it was time to focus on the things that matter. What are the things that matter?
I think that one thing that will come out of this pandemic is a greater focus on life sciences, biosciences as a main engine of the economy. We've gone through a period of 50 years when most innovation happened in digital electronics. And before that, we went through a period when the most innovative field was probably transport. You know, in my grandparents' time, the The first motor cars, the first aeroplanes, the first helicopters, the first spaceships, the first rockets, all happened in one lifetime. Whereas in my lifetime, very few transport innovations at all. The 747, when I was 11 years old, came into service, and it's only just gone out of service. So I don't think the next 50 years will be like the last 50 years. And I think it's therefore worth thinking about what is going to change in the next 50 years. And I think electronics and the digital world is going to run out of steam. I don't think we're going to see as much advance. Already, I find I don't need to renew my my smartphone as often as I used to. Or the opportunities for new devices and new social media platforms and things are not as exciting as they were 10 years ago. So I think that these gene editing techniques, these messenger RNA vaccines, RNA interference, the whole world of biotechnology is very, very exciting. And I think the things that matter in the next 50 years are solving cancer, solving aging, preventing us deteriorating as we reach the end of our lives. I'd like to live to 100, but die healthy. I don't want to live beyond that. And those kind of things. So I think I keep telling my government in the UK, we're good at life sciences in the UK. That might be the engine of the world for the next 30, 40 years. Let's really go for it and see what we can do with it.
Matt, you also mentioned that you disagreed with that vision that said that we have learned during this year that we don't need to travel, we don't need to see our friends, we don't need to consume as many goods, and that it is indeed a bleak future if that happened. There's been this debate throughout the world, or at least there has been shown a worry, mostly maybe in the southern hemisphere, but I think that this discussion has taken place in the northern one as well, when it comes to schools, for example, because we have seen that schools have closed, that some governments and some states have actually pushed for schools closing instead of them being open for children. What's your view on that issue?
Well, we are very fortunate that this virus does not affect children nearly as much as it affects older people. It's a really odd feature of these coronaviruses that they spare children from illness, and it's old people who suffer. We should have made more of that. We should have said, therefore, let's keep the schools open. And some countries like Sweden did that, and certainly for young children, they kept them in school. Because there is nothing more terrible than denying children a year of effective education. It's going to have real consequences for their employment prospects and their life chances, but also for their mental health. And I was very shocked by the degree to which the people who were resisting the reopening of schools in Britain, at least, top of the list was the teaching unions, saying we don't think it's safe for us to go back in school. Well, if it's safe for nurses to go into hospitals, then it is safe for teachers to go into schools. So I do think that was a rather shocking aspect of the whole story. I think education is incredibly important, and it's vital to. And by the way, yes, you can do a lot online in terms of education, but mostly that helps the well-off and the middle class. It doesn't help people at the bottom of society so much. So there is a real equality issue here too.
Following on another one of the threads that you posed to us, Matt, you were talking about innovation, which is an issue that you know a lot and that you have written extensively. How Innovation Works is your latest book, so of course you know about innovation. And you have gone on the record on some of your columns making a case for free market anti-capitalism, which is a discussion on the concept of capitalism and how if we should continue using it, whether it's a correct term or it's not. Some authors, for example, we had Deirdre McCloskey a few weeks ago in one of our events here at Fundación Libertad. She said that we should be talking, for example, about adultism or about innovativism. What's your view nowadays about the concept of capitalism?
I agree with Deirdre McCloskey. I also argue that we should not use the word capitalism to describe what it is that brings prosperity to people, because for most people, it conjures up the importance of capital. And I don't think capital is the most important thing. I think innovation is the most important thing, and that comes out of exchange and commerce, not out of the accumulation of capital, which is what people think about. They think of capitalism as meaning accumulation. So the word I like to use is commerce. It's a neutral word. It means having interchange with people on a commercial basis. I want some more of this, you want some more of that, let's reach a deal. And it feels to me like that's the thing we should emphasize. When I describe myself as a free market anti-capitalist, it's partly to catch attention, of course, but the reason I mean it seriously is that I see an awful lot of what goes on in terms of business these days being essentially very dependent on government favoritism, either for regulatory purposes, raising barriers against competition, or for subsidies, or for contracts. And the more scandals we have about favoritism towards big companies in countries, the more it's telling us that there's too much government involvement, not that there's something wrong with companies. Because if you start a company in, say, the energy field today, you would be mad not to spend a lot of your money lobbying the government for some favoritism. You know, please can I have a subsidy, or please can I be allowed to bid for a contract. So the relationship, an awful lot of business spends a lot of its time thinking about how to please one customer, the government, rather than all the other customers, its consumers. And that's why I'm, in that sense, an anti-capitalist who believes in free markets. I think the best antidote to corruption is to have lots of small companies competing for our interest, and for small companies to have advantages over big companies rather than the other way around.
To keep it tied with what we've been discussing, we're going to get to vaccines, Matt, because you mentioned them, and we want to know what you think about all the discussions that have been going on surrounding them. But before we do so, you also know a lot about artificial intelligence. So let's tie it with innovation. Some people think about artificial intelligence as if it were Terminator and Skynet, and if we were in the middle of Minority Report. And sometimes it can be as simple as just some algorithms tied together, deciding something for us and learning by themselves. Are we getting closer to the kind of worlds that sci-fi authors thought that we would have, or are we still at a crossroads when it comes to artificial intelligence?
Well, I would say that on the one hand, we are developing techniques that are simply magical to anybody who lived 50 years ago. But whenever we have a magic tool from artificial intelligence, we don't think of it as artificial intelligence. We call it GPS or predictive text or something like this, and we get very unfrightened by it. So, you know, the fact that my computer can suggest which word I might want to use next when I'm writing an email, the fact that it can my car can tell me how long it's going to take me to reach my destination and by what route. These are extraordinary, magical, intelligent achievements by machines, but we take them for granted. We don't think of them as intelligence. Oh, in a sense, we're right not to think of them as intelligence. So on the one hand, it is happening, and it's not a problem, and we're quite happy with it. And it's augmenting, not replacing our work. It's helping us rather than displacing us. But on the other hand, the really scary stuff, the Terminator, HAL in 2001, A Space Odyssey, that film, is not happening. And I don't think it's going to happen. 2001, A Space Odyssey is a film that was made more than 50 years ago. And it's already 20 years since it was supposedly set in the future. And we do not have computers that would deliberately lock the door, leaving us isolated in space, or whatever it is that I can't remember. I think that's what he did.
Yeah, I mean, HAL was not a good machine.
HAL's not a nice guy. And one of the reasons why we don't have them is because you would have to build malevolence into these machines. It's not something that's sort of automatically going to emerge, I think, as a result. You know, if you're trying to build a device for delineating tumors on radiograms in hospitals, it's very unlikely that this device would suddenly evolve spontaneously into something that wishes to kill you with a death ray. You know, we have to remember that the evilness that we encounter in the real biological world comes about because evolution favors it, because, you know, there is actually times when people do benefit by behaving badly. So in the human world, there has been selection for bad behavior as well as good behavior. So in that sense, I'm very much less worried than most people. I think there are problems about using artificial intelligence, which we will have to grapple with. And just to give you an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about, suppose we said to a computer, please will you tell us how to predict who's going to commit crimes in society. It would go away and have a think, and it would come back and it would say, I found a very easy way to prevent about 95% of crime in society. Lock up all the males, right? Put all the male people in prison, you will get rid of 95% of crime. Well, we would then have to explain to this computer that, no, that's not an acceptable solution. So I think that AI is going to come up with some slightly embarrassing and rather difficult suggestions about the world that we will have to grapple with.
I was just thinking, and I guess that people in the audience were thinking the same thing. Some governments and some politicians do get those ideas, so that's the part to be worried about, not just the machines. Going back to vaccines, Matt, you just told us, and I guess that we have all seen throughout this last year how innovation and how technology and how everything that surrounds the globalized world in which we live in has helped us get not yet the solution, but to a solution that is getting better each day. But we also seen vaccines in communist countries, just as you said. When we had the communist response to what to do with lockdowns, we also had the communist vaccines, but that's just an adjective. We've also seen this discussion on property rights, intellectual property rights, patents. What's your stance on this vaccine debate that has been going on in the past few weeks?
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. And the first thing to say is that it is a remarkable achievement to have produced vaccines so quickly. But it shouldn't have been a remarkable achievement. We should have been developing vaccine platforms faster than we have. Before the pandemic began, there were several people out there saying it's a disgrace that we haven't accelerated vaccine development because we're going to need them in the future. And I think the reason for that is because vaccines are not very profitable for the pharmaceutical industry, because they either succeed and then do themselves out of business, or they are too expensive for the countries that really need them, or something like that. So on the whole, there has been an underinvestment in vaccine technology compared with what there should have been. And something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, set up by the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, was a good start for this, but it started too late. It only started in 2017. That should have started 10 years earlier. I write in my book about two remarkable women who developed a vaccine for whooping cough in the 1930s in America in 4 years flat. That's good going even today. And they were working on their own, not with any of the huge resources that we have today. In that respect, it is worth noting that Katalin Karikó, who is the hero of the messenger RNA vaccines, the Hungarian woman working in the United States who championed this technology for many, many years, she faced almost total failure for a long time. Her experiments wouldn't work. She couldn't make them work. She got demoted. She lost her grants. Eventually, she contacted a person called Drew Weissman, who made a suggestion that transformed the technology, and it began to work. And then suddenly it's ready to hit prime time during this pandemic. Both the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine are based on this technology. They were the first ones through the regulatory approvals, and it's a concept for vaccine development that is universally applicable. You can simply tune it to whatever target you want, and it should work, and it should be just as safe each time, so you can start to reduce the amount of time you spend checking that it's safe. So this is a very exciting technology. And they didn't even think they were going after infectious disease. They thought they were going after cancer. So it's a wonderful story of innovation coming unexpectedly out of a field that was neglected and ignored, and as a result of a huge amount of trial and error. But onto your question about what we should do about the distribution of vaccines today, I think the first lesson is let's approve them rapidly. We have shown in this pandemic that you can approve the safety of a vaccine much quicker than you would have done before. This is partly because the agencies simply get on with it. They start sooner, they work in parallel, etc. And the European Medicines Agency did not accelerate its procedures, and the British Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency did. And therefore, we were 2 months ahead of Europe in approving vaccines, which we think justifies Brexit all on its own, by the way, but that's another subject. And as for intellectual property, I'm very torn here. My instincts are that I don't like intellectual property. I think it's on the whole a mistake. I think it discourages innovation more than it encourages it in its present form, that it's too strong, too powerful, too much of a barrier to entry to competitive innovators, and that there are better ways of incentivizing innovators. For example, prizes. There's a very nice story about the pneumococcus vaccine that the Gates Foundation caused to be developed. And the way they did it was by dangling a prize in front of the pharmaceutical industry. They said, if you develop a vaccine for this disease, which is killing children in poor countries, which can't afford the vaccine, then we will buy it off you and distribute it. We will essentially give you a contract to purchase this vaccine. So you can be guaranteed a good income if you develop an effective vaccine. And 3 companies immediately responded and did develop vaccines. So that seems to me a very good way of incentivizing innovation, where you do pick the winner, you don't pick the losers, and you don't create the barriers to entry that patents and copyrights create. So I want to see intellectual property eroded during the next few years. But I admit that going to Moderna or Pfizer and saying, sorry, I know you've spent a fortune on this vaccine, but we're now going to take it off you for free and let anybody manufacture it in a knockoff copy way, is clearly not an acceptable way to behave. We are in a world of intellectual property, so we have to admit that it has to play a part. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is in terms of encouraging the distribution of these technologies without damaging the incentives at the moment, but I know where I want to get to.
So much food for thought, Matt, and you're always one thought ahead, because you just mentioned Brexit. I'm going to ask you about Brexit, but before we do so, we are getting a lot of questions. Please keep them sending in through the chat box. We'll get to them in just a couple of minutes. I wouldn't dare say that we are getting into a post-COVID world, because we don't know how that's going to work out, but we are indeed in a post-Brexit world, Matt. How's that been going on since the start of the year?
Well, it's difficult to be clear as to exactly what the effect of Brexit is, because, of course, we're in the middle of the pandemic. Our relations with Europe are not as good as they were. There is clearly an attempt to build trade barriers against us and to make things difficult in Ireland and so on. But the UK was not leaving Europe, was not leaving its alliances. It was leaving a particular top-down centralist bureaucratic empire. That's the way we saw it, those of us who voted for Brexit and thought it was the right thing to do. Because in the end, the European Union is very protectionist, and it is also very insistent on harmonization, that is, doing everything the same everywhere in the continent. And I don't think that works. I think if you're going to innovate, you've got to have local experimentation. You've got to have some countries doing one thing and other countries doing another. Or in the case of America, some states doing one thing and other states doing another, and then copying each other with what works. Well, isn't that a problem if you've got unfair competition? I don't think so. We have a thing called mutual recognition, where we say, if you deem a product safe in your country, then we will deem it safe in our country. We don't mind whether you use the same technique for deciding whether it's safe as we do. That's the difference. I think that insistence on harmonization and centralization and top-down regulation coming from Brussels is the reason that Europe has been poor at innovation over the last 20 or 30 years, compared with both China and America, and why there is no European equivalent of Amazon or Apple or Alibaba in Europe. So I think that for me was the reason why I voted for Brexit. We asked for specific reforms of the European Union, and they said, no, we can't do that. So we said, well, in that case, do you mind if we leave? And they said, well, you have to give us 40 billion pounds. And we said, well, that's quite a lot, but yeah, okay, we'll pay you to leave your club. And they then made a very difficult negotiation over trade, which was very much a zero-sum mentality, not saying, let's make trade as free as possible, because that'll benefit both sides. And that, I'm afraid, reinforced in British minds why we were leaving. They don't see trade as a mutual gain type of operation in Brussels. They do elsewhere in parts of Europe. So we see it as rejoining the world rather than leaving a particular institution. We see our future as a country that can trade as freely as possible with Latin America, North America, Asia, Africa, and so on. And since Brexit, we have signed nearly 70 free trade agreements with other countries in the world, many of them just copying the free trade agreements that the European Union had, but many of them not, many of them going further, with Japan, Australia, and so on. So we think it's going quite well. We think we will be a good neighbor to Europe rather than a bad tenant of part of their property. But there's a lot of work still to do to make it work. And we may have to go to war with the French at some point. Sorry, that's a joke. We won't, I promise.
No, we take it as a joke that it is. You mentioned Ireland. Ireland is a different subject altogether, and quite a complex one at this time to analyze. But with the UK out of the EU, are you worried that, for example, Scotland might try to become independent again? You just mentioned examples of the United Kingdom being open to free trade with all those free trade treaties that they have been celebrating. But would it be possible that an independent UK might not be as liberal as we all would like it to be, for example, on different issues such as immigration or whatever?
Yes, this is a very big concern that people like me might say the reason we have left the European Union is so that we can be a free trading, free market, dynamic economy, and then the British people vote for a high spending, authoritarian, illiberal government. And to some extent that is happening. This government is not as as liberal with a small L as I would like it to be, even though I'm in the same party as the Prime Minister. I don't think my disagreement on that is a secret. You mentioned Scotland, and there is a definite real prospect that Scotland will drift towards independence. The Scottish National Party is very powerful at the moment, and on the whole we've set up the devolution of power to Scotland in such a way that it's very easy for them to spend English money and pretend that it's Scottish money. That's roughly what's happening. So there's a huge amount of money goes from England to Scotland. It's then spent by the Scottish government, which says this is Scottish government spending. See, we could make our country independent and it would be very prosperous. In fact, if Scotland were to become independent, it would not be able to support the social services and so on that it has at the moment to anything like the same extent. And it would have great difficulty setting up its own currency. It would not be able to join the euro immediately. It might do that in time if it wanted to. It would try and keep the pound, but then it would be dependent on our central bank. So there's all sorts of problems in that. We're a very, very integrated economy. I'm sitting less than 50 miles from the Scottish border, and I will be visiting a friend's farm on Saturday, which half of his farm is in Scotland and half of it is in England, and the boundary is in the middle of a field. It's not even the fence on the side of the field. There's literally nothing there at all. So it would be much harder to disentangle Scotland from England than it would be to disentangle Britain from the European Union. But it might happen. I can't rule it out.
Well, we are taking questions from the audience. Matt, we have Juan Sebastián Landoni referencing one of your best talks, one of that I like a lot. If ideas have sex, do they get married and divorced?
Yeah, well, I used that analogy not just as a way of catching attention, because I think it is actually quite a precise metaphor for what is going on. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. And in evolutionary biology, sex plays a very important role because it reshuffles genes. It means that it's possible for you to inherit a good mutation from one parent and another good mutation from another parent and bring them together so they work well together. And that's the role that sex plays. Without that, you have to choose, do I want this mutation or that mutation? You can't have them both. Because of sex, you can have both. And so I see trade and exchange as playing exactly the same role in human economics as sex plays in evolutionary biology. And therefore, that the invention of the habit of exchange was the absolutely critical invention in human history that allowed us to embark upon the project of prosperity, of growth, of rising living standards. It couldn't have happened without. So in that sense, I'm making a very explicit analogy. But I also really do like to suggest that all the technologies that you have on your desk in front of you. I mean, here's a technology invented, I think, by an Argentinian, a biro.
Exactly. Biro, yeah.
Biro. Do you call him? I don't know.
No, we call it Birome, but the last name of the inventor was Biro.
Biro, yeah. And this is a very simple technology, you would think. But actually, when you look at it, it has plastic, it has metal, it has ink, it has see-through things. These are different ideas that had occurred to different people at different places in different times. And then they came together in this one object. And that, for me, is the same way that mutations in different lineages can come together through sex. So ideas, meeting, mating, and having baby ideas really does happen, I think. Now, divorce, I'll have to think about that one. I can't think of a parallel for idea divorce.
Maybe you'll end up finding one afterwards.
I'll
Carlos,
ask Bill Gates. He'll know about it at the moment.
hey, Carlos Pirovano asked, your book, The Red Queen, can be understood like an apology of the selfishness in nature versus the opposite vision over a more communitary target. How do you think that combines nature, selfishness, and community?
I feel very strongly that the more we understood evolutionary biology and genetics, the more we realized that human goodness is just as innate and just as evolved as human badness. That actually, far from teaching the lesson that everybody's in it for themselves, once we discovered that the units that are in it for themselves are the genes, we then realized that sometimes they achieve their ends by making the individuals generous. So to give a very obvious example, people are nice to their children. They spend money on them. They look after them. They take them to the doctor. You know, they do all these nice things to their children. The reason they do that is because that's in the interests of the genes. It's not in the interests of the parents. So that's a very obvious example of altruistic, benevolent behavior evolving in a genetic way. And I think there are lots of other examples. I mean, I make the case in later books that human beings stumbled on another very important technique, which was mutual exchange. You know, that if you develop the habit of working for each other, then you can raise each other's living standards. And this became a sort of almost an instinct in human beings as well.
Michael Nichols asks, how do you prevent life sciences from being overly politicized as we've seen in the pandemic? It seems the two don't mix very well. And adds, #follow the science is not so simple.
Well, I think this is a very good point. And I have been dismayed by some of the ways in which science has been politicized during the pandemic. Not just during the pandemic, but during the climate change debates as well. I'm particularly thinking of the influence of modeling. I think modeling is obviously useful at times, but it has become much too powerful politically. And we've seen some egregious examples in this country, certainly from Imperial College particularly, of models being treated as if they were real data. Just to give a very, very recent example, only a little more than a month ago, the models were telling us that we would face a third wave in the UK as bad as the second wave. Now the models are saying, no, we're not actually. There's probably going to be no third wave at all, maybe a tiny bump in the autumn. Well, how can you be so wrong in 1 month? And the answer, of course, is because you feed in assumptions. And the assumptions that go into models are, in the previous case, that the vaccine wasn't very effective and so on. Well, that was, you know, already wrong. But even if it wasn't wrong, you didn't know. And if you don't know, you should say, I don't know. You shouldn't print out a specific graph. Sorry, I've slightly got distracted from Michael's question, which is about the life sciences getting over politicized. I think he's hinting at something which is quite important, which is that the physical scientists have become very political because of climate change and other things. But until recently, the life sciences were perhaps immune from this. That you know, on the whole, you're getting on with trying to find a cure for cancer or whatever it is that you're doing, and you don't need to worry about whether or not that's what the politicians want. But we've now seen a lot of scientists get very involved in government decision-making, spending a lot of time on the media in recent years, and I think that might. I think that might be a mistake. I think it's a worry that we need to be careful of, because I'm a great believer that science should not be political, and yet more and more I think it is. I think more and more you get people producing results to push particular points of view.
Enrique Bargioni asks, how do you unleash innovation in countries where the government and its bureaucracies are the biggest obstacle to innovation?
Well, reduce the bureaucratic hurdles is the short answer. Easier said than done, I know. But the rewards for a country that simplifies bureaucratic decision-making are enormous. Just look at China. 40 years ago, under Deng Xiaoping, China liberalized its economy. It didn't liberalize its politics very much. In fact, it's hardly done so at all. But it did liberalize economic decision-making. So it essentially said to initially farmers and then to entrepreneurs, if you want to go out and start your own business and do something a little bit different from your neighbors, you no longer need permission from the commune or from the local party to do so. You can build a building, you can start a factory, you can invent a widget, you can do whatever it is you want. The result was the most extraordinary and spectacular boom in living standards that there has ever been. Now, many people read the Chinese experience as saying, oh, look, so a big, powerful government is a good thing because it encourages economic growth. I think that's the wrong lesson. The right lesson from China is that if you strip away the bureaucratic hurdles to entrepreneurship, you get a lot of it, because the average entrepreneur in China faces very few obstacles similar to what a Western or probably a Latin American entrepreneur faces. As long as he doesn't annoy the Communist Party, he can do pretty well what he likes. He doesn't face the hundreds of form-filling, time-wasting bureaucratic delays that slow down entrepreneurs in the West. So that lesson is there for all to see. And it's just amazing to me that more governments in the world don't try to follow that lesson.
We have a lot of people worried about artificial intelligence in the chat box. Paul Howard asks, does that mean that artificial wisdom is impossible when we were discussing artificial intelligence?
I don't think anything's impossible, but I know what, I do think artificial general intelligence, which may be another word for artificial wisdom, is a very long way off. That we are designing all sorts of specialized artificial intelligence, that can calculate your route in a car, or can predict your text, or can diagnose cancers in an X-ray or something like that. These are specific skills that are going to be acquired. But I think the tendency to sit back and scratch your head and say, I wonder if E equals MC squared. I don't think we're going to see that unless we specifically build it into computers. I don't quite know why that is. And it's a topic that I have wrestled with in various ways, but have never quite given myself a satisfactory answer for. So while I don't think artificial wisdom is impossible, I do think it's a long way off.
We have people worried about artificial intelligence, as I told you, Matt. We have, for example, Gilberto Anaya that posits the next question. What are the perils for individual rights given that new and innovative technology is already capable of locating and tracing everything a person does, even in real time? I think they have watched Person of Interest and then they are worried about what's going to happen with us.
I think preserving personal liberty is a huge challenge in this world. 10 years ago, I was much more optimistic about this. I was saying things like the internet is a bottom-up phenomenon that can't be controlled. What's the expression that I think it was Bill Clinton used? Regulating the internet is like nailing Jello to the wall. You just can't do it. And it's a many-to-many technology, not a one-to-many technology like television. Therefore, the tools of propaganda have been removed from governments and the tools of, and also you can be secret on the internet, you can communicate without anybody knowing. It's not so easy to tap your phone, etc. In the 10 years since then, I've been proved partly wrong about all that we've seen the way social media actually does allow propaganda. We've seen the way in which China has been able to effectively turn the internet onto its head and make it into a centralized and top-down system which can be controlled. They have nailed Jello to the wall, if you like. And I think we're seeing something similar here in the West, even as a result of the pandemic. And that does worry me. The battle for personal liberty is never won. It has to be continually refought. And in the world of artificial intelligence, yes, there will be fresh battles. But I'm not yet pessimistic. I think that we can win these arguments.
Alexander Price was also asking about social media, which you just mentioned. What are your views on social media as an innovation? It's arguably the most powerful force out there at the moment, but has its power been harnessed correctly? Although I thought experiment to tie in, what would the world's response have been to COVID-19 without social media, which kind of ties back with what the pandemic would have been 10 years ago, which you said at the beginning.
Yeah. 3 or 4 things to say about social media. First is we didn't see it coming. Isn't that interesting? You know, it should be obvious in retrospect that once you had invented the internet and everybody was talking to each other, that the most powerful way to use the internet was going to be a form of social media. In fact, you go back to the 1990s, people are saying the opposite. They're saying the trouble with the internet is it's going to separate us. It's going to make us antisocial. It's going to make us all into nerds, and we're never going to talk to each other. It made us rampantly social. You know, we became obsessed with our social networks as a result of the internet. So we didn't see that coming. It took us by surprise. I saw it as an entirely benevolent concept to start with. I really enjoyed the fact that the news media was becoming democratized, that I could decide who I listened to without an editor telling me who I should be paying attention to. I then, like everyone else, have been surprised, shocked, and dismayed by the degree to which the filter bubble, the preference bubble, has the echo chamber has come to dominate social media, and that far from bringing us together in a sort of kumbaya sort of way, it has polarized us and pushed us apart. Interestingly, the same phenomenon happened with radio 100 years ago. When radio first came in, there were some very utopian arguments saying this is the most incredible technology. It will bring everybody together. All the peoples of the earth will see each other's point of view. Well, it didn't. It led to the rise of the dictators. Radio was a very big tool used by Mussolini and Hitler, and so on. Now we have tamed radio. We no longer think of radio as a threat in that sense. So we will tame social media, but that's not a very encouraging parallel because we had to have a world war to achieve that.
I was just thinking about War of the Worlds when you mentioned radio and how things have changed since then. We still have time for a couple more questions before we finish our allocated hour, Matt. Gonzalo Schwartz asks, the key in how innovation works is how so many inventions have been key to people's day-to-day lives. Why do you think there is still opposition to innovation and progress unless it fits a specific narrative of what progress should be? And why do not more policymakers use the discourse of the impact of entrepreneurship and innovation has to increase human flourishing and freedom, and policymakers still focus on inequality or other less impactful policy concerns?
Yeah, no, Gonzalo makes a very good point. I mean, I sit in Parliament in London, and we spend about 99% of our time talking about how to distribute government generosity, and we spend about 1% of our time talking about how to increase the amount of money available through entrepreneurship and enterprise, as far as I can make out. He's right that given the incredible improvements in our everyday lives that innovation produces, it's remarkable how many people are against it. They don't say they're against it. They say they're in favor of it. But then they do things that show that they want to be very precautionary. They want to be very careful. They want to be very suspicious of new technologies. Why is this? It's partly a pessimism bias, that we have inside ourselves a tendency to worry about things that might go wrong. It's partly a vested interest. There are companies and organizations out there that actually feel threatened by innovation, and therefore they do their best to lobby against it, to raise barriers to entry. I give the example in the book of the introduction of coffee to Europe in the 1500s, hugely resisted by lots and lots of people, mainly because of the beer and wine industry campaigning against it. Very similar to what happened with genetically modified crops in Europe 500 years later. And it's partly that there is a sort of a tendency to campaign against innovation. I mean, that it can be very profitable to do so. A lot of NGOs, a lot of pressure groups don't say they're against technology, but going around stirring up fear about technology is very lucrative for them, and they do that. Notice that when a device comes along like a mobile telephone that is really, really, really useful, we are quite happy to dismiss the people who raise the worries. So, there was a lot of talk that mobile phones might fry our brains with short microwave radiation or whatever it was when they first came along. And basically the consumer said, stuff that, I want to use a mobile phone, it's too useful. So when there is enough utility for the consumer, we do seem to be able to overcome the resistance.
So we are 2 minutes to the hour. We have a lot of questions, but we only have 1 hour. I'm going to ask you the last one, Matt, and it's going to give you the chance to play with the question, because is there something that you would have liked to have been asked but I didn't ask you?
You've asked some very good questions. So short answer is no, but let me think of something. I would the subject that fascinates me, and I would give a very poor answer to, but I love grappling with, is why innovation is so obvious and inevitable when you look backwards. Social media, the search engine, it's obvious that you get search engines in 1990, that you get social media in 2000, but it's not predictable. People are terribly bad at predicting the future of technology, really, really bad. I mean, I give quotes in my book of some appalling predictions that people made about the future, and very clever people, and I'm the same. People are always asking me, so go on, tell me what innovation is going to do in the year 2050. And I say, look, don't ask that question. It's a stupid question. Nobody can give you an intelligent answer to it. So if the past is so obvious, why is the future so opaque?
And that's just a great phrase to end our interview with you today, Matt. We want to thank you a lot for your time, for your generous time, for your generous reflections and ideas that you share with us today. And I guess that the audience is also happy on the other side, and the people watching us on YouTube when this is uploaded. And we are getting some electronic claps, some virtual claps, and thank yous on the chat box. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us here at Fundación Libertad today. And we'd love to have you in Argentina at some point when the world allows us again to travel as freely as we all want to do.
Yes, please. I would love to do that.
So we just had Matt Ridley with us here today. Thank you. And then we have How Innovation Works. That his latest book. If you haven't read it, go buy it and read it right now. Thank you so much, Matt. And now I'm going to close in Spanish. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Estamos cerrando este evento de Fundación Libertad. Ansiamos verlos la próxima vez. So until the next time. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.